Hello and welcome to Edukemy's YouTube channel. My name is Singh, and in this video we shall discuss a very important theme that is related to disasters risk reduction. It is called as Global Assessment Report on Disaster Risk Reduction, produced by United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and this is the 2022 report that we are speaking of. A very important report to understand, which says that the number of disasters in the world will increase 40% from the previous times. We'll explain this all and the issues and related constraints and concerns. Before that, let me welcome all of you. Amlan, Hima, Kriti, Ashish, Bhavani, all of you, welcome. Kim, welcome all of you. And people watching offline and later, welcome to all of you. Now, you can see this graph very well states that the number of disasters in the world have only increased since the last 40 years, 1980, and the data about the trend of the disasters was such that we had 100 disasters, approximately 100 disasters around the whole world by the year 1980. And now, by the time we are going into 2030, we will be seeing an escalation of 40% of disasters just from the previous times. 560 disasters have been predicted, as the report itself very clearly mentions, disasters every year by 2030. And right now, the number of disasters that we see is approximately 440. Right, 400 disasters in 2015 to 560 disasters projected in 2030. In 15-year framework, the time that was also given for Sendai framework to establish some principles on which disaster management should happen. The same time framework, and you see a 40% increase in disasters happening. So good comparison happening. However, what are the impacts? What are the issues? Let's understand those. There are not just economic impacts of any disaster. If you have a look at the disasters around the world, there could be climatic disasters and non-climatic disasters. Some of them are not directly dependent on the way humans have treated the earth. If there are volcanoes, we don't know much about it. If there are natural earthquakes, there are earthquakes produced by human interventions as well. So natural earthquakes, we can't say much about this. What about nature-induced droughts? There are drought-prone areas. So those cannot be said much about. However, there are risks and disasters which have been produced with the help of human intervention. Now, the impact is not just an economic loss caused because of, say, suppose having a flood-ridden area. The economic loss is also complemented with social loss. When people start to migrate from one place to another, there is marginalization of the communities in further aspects. For example, the opportunities available to them, the jobs available to them, they no longer will be available. The kind of languages and the kind of culture that people live in will have to change, and they will have to transit from one place to another, possibly live in another area which is not something that they have culturally been subjected to. So there is not just an economic loss, there is a social loss as well. You look at these disasters and all of them reflect what is happening in the environment, our ecosystem. They have a sizable component of environmental loss as well. Environment loss is also there because of the systemic linkages of these kind of disasters. So having understood economic, social, environmental dimensions, there are quite a few other dimensions as well. For example, personal loss. When economy does not relate to every individual, the family does. The family understands what is the meaning of a personal loss, the value of loss of that specific life that was our own or related to ourselves. Similarly, if you can relate to cultural loss, what about the people who have migrated because of some simple examples, developmental projects? When people living in jungle areas got migrated from one place to another, they lost the culture of living on the forest products. They started to migrate to urban areas where they had to strive for another activity. The temperature in urban areas were different because of urban heat island. The kind of behavior they were subjected to was far different from what they used to have or were subjected to while they were residing in the jungle area. So look at the cultural loss for people. This is also very, when gained at a bigger level, this is also resulting into a national loss and a global loss. And right now we are only speaking of humans, Homo sapiens. But when we translate this to animals, they also go through some kind of losses. right? Genetic loss, the loss of, because that is the rate, because animals cannot speak the language that we speak. We do not understand the kind of personal loss they go through, the kind of cultural loss they go through, the kind of national loss it causes. All we understand is that this is a genetic loss, and we call it as IUCN, critically endangered species, or extinct in the wild, or extinct everywhere. However, this loss is not just for animate but inanimate objects as well. The kind of losses that are related to global tragedies, disasters. These disasters, as I mentioned, are set to increase 40% in the 15 years same framework in which we see Sendai framework working. Sendai, a place in Japan, this is where the countries around the world met to initiate a framework under which the agenda was four-pillared. First, to understand what is disaster risk, what is the disaster risk associated with a disaster. Strengthening disaster risk governance. So, understanding the disaster risk, the government, how it participates is what they want. They want to invest and they want to enhance the preparedness, right? So, understand the risk, make the government participate, invest in it, and make the people more prepared. This is what are the four pillars of Sendai framework, and the areas of cooperation were for 15 years. The idea was to understand three things: exposure to hazards, vulnerability of people to hazards, and the type of hazard this is. So why each of them are different? Exposure to hazard is what is the level of exposure of the individual or ecosystem to that hazard. For example, if Iceland goes through repeated number of volcanoes, what is the subject of this exposure to the world population, to the natural population? For example, over Iceland only there are many air routes, and when these volcanoes happen, the complete area is covered in dust. So it impacts global economy, especially the air economy. And what is the vulnerability of people, and how this hazard is different from another hazard? This is what is the understanding that was needed under Sendai framework. And what would it do? It would create a way in which newer disasters don't happen, right? Reduce the present number of disasters and create a resilience through which even if disasters happen, people are able to cope up with it very well. Now, one simple example of a disaster and how it can impact and why it impacts so much is through an example of what happened in Dominica, a Central American country, island nation, right? Now, 90 to 95% of homes were damaged or destroyed. Imagine if we did not understand the way in which disaster impacts us. This is what would happen. 90 to 95% of homes would be damaged. 90% plus crops were destroyed. The amount accounting was 225% of 2016's GDP, and accounting for impact on 93% of country's population. Now rate this. Why have I mentioned this particular case is because I would like you to see what Sendai framework was about. Was Sendai framework about pointing out the exposure to hazard, the vulnerability, and the type of disaster this is? Yes. The four pillars were simply about ensuring that this kind of preparedness be ensured, that people are more resilient to more kind of disasters. Even if the disasters do not reduce, people are more resilient. The impact of disaster is reduced, but then this is not happening. We see 95% homes destroyed or damaged, 90% plus crops destroyed, accounting for 93% of the population which got impacted, and more than 200% of the country's GDP. Dominica. Funds were poured from all around the world so that the country could rehabilitate itself, right? Now, whenever you see, this is a graphic that I captured from the report itself, Disaster Risk Reduction Report of the United Nations. They speak about the risk associated relate with the exposure to the hazard, the vulnerability that individual has, and the hazard themselves. And they also relate to the human, the way it impacts is socio-economic processes, the pathways of progress, adaptation and mitigation, migration actions, governance, all of them are related to disaster processes. So whenever you look at any disaster, look at the various aspects in which it impacts human beings, what can be done to mitigate this, and similar kind of mitigation strategies have been adopted by various countries. For example, India adopting a strategy for reducing disasters at sea. we just studied in the current affairs inquest, and inquest helps in understanding not only what is the availability of resources, marine resources at some places, but it also helps with the help of geo-based augmentation system GAGAN, SBAS, satellite-based augmentation systems, how to navigate through those places which are prone to disasters in the seas. Inquest does that, and people's lives have been saved. Similarly, there are ways in which we have understood how the disaster of tsunami works and how one can save their life from it. Similarly, the government also issues, if you've seen these days, yellow, red, orange alert whenever a disaster is about to strike and people can be saved from these kind of disasters. Indian Meteorological Department also serve these kind of warnings. Now, when you see, these disasters have a cascading nature, and that is why the impact is not curtailed to just economic loss or social loss. It leads to the complete ecosystem loss. And one kind of disaster may induce the other kind of disaster. Simple example of this is corona pandemic itself. Though we don't know if it was natural or human induced, but then the disaster that was in the form of a pandemic, it resulted into multiple other disasters in economic arena, in social arena. We know that the impact on humans, the impact on females, the impact on small children, elderly life, the extreme pressure on earning finances, cascading nature of any disaster. Pick up any of the disasters in these images and you would see that there is a cascading nature of the disaster in the complete ecosystem, and it is very much possible that one disaster will continue in propagation while it hands over the baton to the next disaster. Does it not happen to India? When we see floods in rainy season and in the summer season we see drought at the same place? Yes, that is the same place that we see both the activities happening because of increasing percentages of disaster around the whole world. These are transboundary risks. No country can handle a specific disaster by itself. They will have to collaborate and merge their forces, because these disasters happen at systemic levels. They do not know the national boundaries. That is why Sendai framework was adopted. What one must know is the know-how. Share the know-how, develop early warning systems as much as possible, and these are the particular parts of Sendai framework as well. All right, so disaster, mortality, monitoring and mortality, number of people who are getting affected, that must be known, to know the economic loss, right? How to disrupt this kind of loss, what are the disaster reduction strategies that the nations have applied, and what is the cooperation that the developing countries are getting, along with that the early warning systems which have been developed, right? So early warning system is different from the risk reduction strategies, right? Mitigation strategies, adaptation strategies, how developing countries have been helped, what is the loss. So one end you see how we are getting more aware about the disaster, and the second part is how we are trying to ensure that the impact on humans is the least. When you see the points that I have written, this is the most significant part when you can talk specifically about disaster risk reduction, right? This is a part of Sendai framework, and this is something that you can present in all your answers when you speak about how to understand some things about disaster, to be able to do three things. As I mentioned, eliminate new risks, reduce possible risks, and in case they happen, increase the resilience of human beings. And that was the case study of Dominica, where you understood that if these things do not happen, there will be continued increase in the disasters and further increase or cascading effect on the impact on human beings as well, right? Now, getting back to what we have. Now, these are important aspects of GS paper 3. When you look at economy, and when you look at specifically disaster management, there is a separate section for disaster management, and these kind of inputs can be put in any of the disasters on which the question is asked, whether it is landslide, forest fire, or earthquake. All these questions have come in the examination. And just this last year, 2021, we had 3 questions on landslide itself, and you can provide these kind of points there as well, right? How they have a cascading nature, how they are not a country related phenomena, how it is systematically related to all the other kind of issues in the country, how Sendai framework can be helpful. So these are the very good points that you can be utilizing. And you can also quote the United Nations itself. The Office of Disaster Risk Reduction itself says that there will be 40% increase in the disasters from 2015 levels to 2030. What can we do now? If disasters are happening, we will have to look at ways in which we can curtail this. And the report, when I saw the report, 200 plus pages, it clearly mentions the impact on poorer people, the impact on hunger, the impact of marginalized communities, the impact that women face. One has to look at those perspectives from social perspective, the cascading impacts of this, understanding which are the high risk countries. The Paris Agreement also talks about reducing these kind of disasters with the help of reduction in the temperature, the global temperature that we have targeted, but very tough to reach that. But even then, risk identification process for better estimation of disasters, risk identification. So infrastructure, global supply chains are there, systemic risk are involved. This is a cascading nature, cascading disaster, and we have to address this kind of disaster. What measures can we take? So since this is a transboundary risk, we have to take some kind of measure which can be helpful in short and long term both. Right now we are able to only look at the short term because we want urgent support. If there is an earthquake, we have to support the people immediately and urgently, and we will slowly understand how to build the resilient buildings just like Japan has. Similarly, we will have to understand the systemic risk involved. Possibly, if we know that Bihar every year goes through floods, and Assam also every year goes through floods, there is an innate loss of animal life, plant life, and human life, then we should start learning how to ensure that the habitation of people is not along the river banks. So when we understand the systemic risk associated, we will have to take steps, adapt and adopt to the systemic changes that are happening naturally, right? Incremental action can have a powerful cumulative impact provided we take that action, and cumulative impact will only happen when we understand the systemic risk associated. See, once you present these kind of ideas, a couple of sentences like this, an examiner will know who you are and what capabilities you have. So just a couple of sentences. Incremental action can have a powerful cumulative impact. How did we get this kind of statement? Did we create it? Yes, somebody or the other has created it, and we ourselves can learn the same habit. How can we? By firstly adopting this, by adapting to what is written here. All right. Okay. So we get bias to short-term thinking, which is just natural to be able to evade the imminent crisis. We have to handle the current crisis, but then looking into the long term, we'll have to look at systemic approach, designing approaches, systemic approaches, which are based on risk assessment, which are based on understanding the kind of vulnerabilities people have, the kind of hazards that occur in those local areas, and technical know-how that people have. Importance of risk communication, modern technology. These are the aids. These are the ways in which one can aid. Importance of risk communication, modern technology, risk communication to people, future investments in those areas, communication with people, and responding to people perception of these disasters. Some people feel we have to live in these disasters. That's not actually true, right? There are some potential barriers and incentives that we have put here, which are about disaster management. Incentives of handling a disaster is that the government does not have to look at the steps in which disasters can be handled. Rather, they look at how they can be mitigated. So government fiscal, government resources can be spent in a better way, right? Similarly, if we involve community, then it is a better process because we have a wider engagement. People understand rather than only government understanding and making people do. So these are the advantages on one side. On the other hand, there are issues as well. When we look at speaking about disaster, people are more averse to it. It is a psychology where people do not understand what is the crisis. In fact, when a crisis happens and then you come to help, people understand that more. People do not understand who to communicate to the risk properly. There are people who avoid conversations on disasters just because they know that people are not going to listen to. So there are some people who really want to participate, yet they are not having the capacity, whether it be finances, whether it be the influence, and that's how disasters do happen at places. All right. Now, risk is increasing globally. as are the number and cost of disaster. As risk multiplies, it has the increasing impacts on communities and the whole systems. Absolutely, communities and whole systems. Global impact become local and vice versa. What a beautiful conclusion to this. That's why reading. With the experience of COVID and climate change, uncertainty has become very much certain. The best defense against future shocks is to transform systems now and build resilience by addressing climate change and hazards. Okay, so I would like you people to remember or note down this part. All right, this part. Risk has increased and so has the number and cost of disaster. Risk multiplies, impact is on communities and whole systems. And uncertainty is the truth of life now. The best defense is to become shock-proof systems by transforming systems and building resilience for communities and the earth processes. That's how we complete a topic like this. So what did we study here? Let's look at that. What we studied in this theme, disaster risk reduction. This is the United Nations report, and I have presented fragments of this report. We spoke about the increasing disaster, right? The report itself mentioned 40% increase in the 15 years. We understood what Sendai framework is about, what are the kind of risks associated, what are the ways in which Sendai framework works. We understood the example of Dominica and how this systemic change, if not studied and applied, will lead to destruction of the complete ecosystem. We understood how there is a cascading nature of any disaster. We covered quite a few disasters to understand how each of them become cascading, not only for humans and their life, but also for other systems as well, other processes like other animate and inanimate entities. We also understood what are the ways in which disasters can be handled, mitigated, managed, adapted, right? So some examples from Bihar, some examples from ocean areas, some example from places where floods are happening. This is how we covered in an article like this, and we also understood some of the ways in which people tackle it. People tackle it proactively, or people do not speak about it, and the reasons about this, right? The impacts of disasters, the bad impacts, and also a few good impacts of disasters. What? We understand the difference between what is sorrow and happiness. Every time there is a sorrow, there is also a time for happiness just ahead of it, right? So life is full of curves, twists and turns. And that's how disasters teach us. They also teach us that this is a way in which cleansing happens. Cleansing. Flooding is a disaster. Cleansing happens because of it, and because of which people are able to renew their lives again and again, right? So struggle and survival, right? It makes us understand that human instinct is that of survival, right? This is where we also understood the component where humans look at the immediate step, that is how to mitigate or how to save themselves, rather than looking at the long-term impact of the disaster. Systemic change is to be applied, study has to be applied at systemic levels to avoid the cascading effect of disasters. This is how we cover a topic like this. Let me see if there are questions. OSMART scheme, yes, OSMART across scheme, all on disaster management and under Ministry of Ocean or Ministry of Earth Sciences. I think Earth Sciences, Ministry of Earth Sciences. Both these schemes were very important for the last year and this year as well, because there are updates on extension of these schemes, OSMART and across schemes. Gopal, good evening. Kim, good evening. And Kim says, Kiribati buying land in Fiji, one example. See? So those places which are going to get immersed will face disasters. All right. So if you like this initiative, share some love through likes, comments and shares, and let's keep studying. Let's keep the spirits high, because we know that we are confident people. We can do well. What is required is that we keep our efforts going on day in and day out. That's what our efforts are going to. That's how the efforts are going to yield results for us. All right. So worry less, study well, prepare well, make your notes. Don't make your routine go haywire. Keep it intact. Keep several hours for organized work, several hours for your unorganized work, where you know that when you don't know what to do and how to do, but then several hours which you are consistent at must be must be ensured that it continues. All right. So Bhavani, Amlan, Ministry of Earth Sciences, thank you. Kanupriya, you are also there. Good evening to you. Amlan, Babani, Kanupriya, Hima, Tiyasha also there. Good evening. Kim, Preeti, Amlan, all of you, good night and take care. I will see you all. Good night, everybody. And keep watching the current affairs. I'm sorry, the editorials as well. They are very, very relevant. Thank you.